Hey everyone, welcome to my second video. Today I decided to go a little lighter. Instead of talking about history, I just want to share the impressions that I had of Washington D.C. during my short stay there. Important to say this up front. These impressions come from my own perspective as a young male adult traveling alone. So someone traveling with family or for work or living here long term would probably have a very different experience than I had. So in summary, this video isn't about telling you what Washington DC is. It's about what it felt like to me as a visitor and while moving through it and observing my surroundings. Before we start, I think I just want to share the parts of the city that I've been to. I stayed only for 4 nights and I stayed within a few areas and got to know them not only by walking but mostly by walking, which I think shapes our perception of a city a lot. I stayed close to the wharf, which immediately set a certain tone for the trip. It's a very modern area, very open, very clean, and clearly designed with visitors in mind. There were a lot of commercial buildings there, like modern buildings, and there's also a very cool pier with bars and restaurants and a concert house. From there, I also spent a lot of time walking through the National Mall, and this is the Washington D.C. that most people imagine. Wide open spaces, monuments, museums, that kind of thing. I also walked around Penn Quarter near the White House. It's an area with wide avenues, large and historic buildings, nice restaurants and fancy hotels. It honestly impressed me how quiet it was. For like a downtown area, it was really quiet. Georgetown was one of the areas that felt more distinct to me. Walking there felt closer to an European city than to most American ones. There were many people walking. There was a nice park near the river. It felt really alive. Capitol Hill was another neighborhood, more residential. It was pretty calmer. Walking there also gave me the impression of a city that's lived in, not just visited. It felt very stable, quiet, and very structured. I also walked a little bit on Chinatown, which felt smaller and more compressed compared to Chinatowns in other cities. And I think it blends very quickly into the surrounding downtown. It's a present Chinatown, but it's not really dominant, when you compare to like Chinatowns in New York or San Francisco, for example. And finally, Adams Morgan is probably the last neighborhood I've been. It felt more younger, more energetic. I think they have more nightlife there, more movement. There's more diversity in how people use the spaces. It feels less ceremonial and more spontaneous, like a place where the city loosened up a bit. Experiencing these neighborhoods back to back made it clear that Washington isn't just one city. You can shift the moods depending on where you are, from symbolic and formal to residential and lived in, sometimes within just a few blocks. One thing that really stood out to me about Washington is how easy it is to get around without a car. At least for the areas I visited, this felt like one of the better cities of the US in terms of public transportation. The metro covered almost everything I needed, and when it didn't, the bus filled the gaps pretty smoothly. And moving between neighborhoods doesn't feel complicated or stressful. I'm not sure how it is to move to distant neighborhoods or suburbs, but at least close to the center you can get pretty much anywhere with the subway and the buses, which is pretty cool. But beyond that, Washington is still a very walkable city. There are many times where I could have taken the metro but chose to walk instead, not because the route was shorter, but because the walk itself felt really worth it. And also because I feel that the scenery changes constantly, even long stretches don't feel empty or repetitive. There's almost always something happening, people passing by, buildings changing scale, monuments appearing in the distance. So walking for me never felt like dead time here, it felt like part of the experience. Walking so much also made me think a lot about safety, because you really feel a city differently when you are on foot. Personally, I felt safe throughout my time here, including at night. Again, this is coming from a male experience. I walked alone many times after dark, and I never felt uneasy or on edge, especially in and around the downtown areas. What contributes to the feeling I guess, is the presence of people. Washington is a city where you see many families. Perhaps the city in the West where I saw the most children. You see families, school excursions, people walking with dogs, joggers, couples, even outside typical tourist hours. I also noticed women walking alone at night, which, for me, is always a strong indicator of how safe a place feels, regardless of what my own impression was. Obviously, that doesn't mean that nothing ever happens here. No city is perfect, but from a pedestrian perspective, Washington felt very calm and easygoing for me. I'm gonna stop talking here real quick because I want you guys to feel the energy of the park a little bit and also hear the drums without me talking over it. Now, switching topics, one of the things that genuinely surprised me about Washington was the food. I know it's one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the US, and that really shows once you start paying attention to the variety of restaurants within the city. But what stood out to me the most was how many Ethiopian restaurants there are. That wasn't something I expected at all before coming, and along with that, I came across Afghan, Lebanese, and many other cuisines that you don't always find so easily concentrated in one place. And the impression I got is that the food in Washington isn't really built around a single identity. It doesn't try to define itself through a signature cuisine like New Orleans, probably, but instead it's just like a big and international city. It reflects the people who live and work here. Something I didn't expect was how much I ended up talking to people here, more than I ever did in any other place in the US I've traveled. From the moment I left the airport, the atmosphere felt more calm and friendly than I anticipated. People seemed more open to conversations, and this is my experience again, comparing with many other large American cities I've been. And there were quite a few moments that stuck with me because usually when I travel, especially alone, I don't talk much to people. I just stay quiet, and if someone talks to me, I would engage in the conversation, but I'm not the one like pushing someone to talk. But there were quite a few moments that stuck with me. For example, I met a guy in the line of a bakery and he ended up paying for my breakfast. We sat at a table and had a really nice conversation. Also, something that I always do when I'm traveling is I try to go to a jazz club. I think it's a great place where you can feel the city a little bit and interact with people, and it's also the jazz scenery. You can talk to the musicians, and I really like that. Everybody's very open, it's very intimate. And this time in DC, I ended up talking with a woman. She was a professor at a university, and we talked for like a long time. And she's the reason that I visited this park that you are seeing right now on screen. She told me about the drums encounters that happen on weekends, and I thought that it was pretty cool, so I decided to go and shoot. And I think this part of the city really represents what I felt about DC. It's a place where people, they are open, they are. I went obviously in a not so cold period. It was March, but I just felt that it is a very diverse city, and people were very open to me. Also in this afternoon in the park, a guy just started asking me about my cameras, and we ended up talking a lot about sports and the cameras. So anyway, it was just a city that I had many random encounters with people, and those interactions together, they ended up shaping my impression of DC. People felt really approachable, polite, and generally kind. Not sure how other people feel about it, but that was my impression at least. And switching now to kind of like the atmosphere or the architecture and urbanism of the city, one of the strongest impressions that I had of DC is that it is a planned city. You feel immediately, there's a symmetry, there's long sight lines, and the way monuments are integrated into the everyday movement instead of being isolated. For me, it really feels like a capital city. Especially around the National Mall, architecture feels really symbolic. They use a lot of columns, white stone, and classical proportions that draw heavily from ancient Greek and Roman traditions. I don't think it's meant to feel like modern or personal, but timeless and representative. In Georgetown, the feeling changes completely. The architecture is older, it's more intimate, and clearly rooted in British colonial traditions. At times, it actually reminded me of Boston, especially in the scale of the streets and the use of brick. It feels lived in and less symbolic. And I also had a great time in Georgetown. I found like a local market that happened on weekends, and it was like a huge market. They were selling everything from even soccer jerseys that you don't see very often, many cameras, and that regular stuff that you see on those Sunday markets. But it was really cool. As you move farther away from the National Mall, I think Washington slowly stops feeling like a capital and starts feeling more like a regular city. In Adams Morgan, for example, it's a neighborhood that really reinforced that impression on me. I also spent an afternoon there in a park, and I watched how people were enjoying the city. And it was really cool. I really had a great time there. Another thing that shapes the atmosphere for me is the greenery. There are trees everywhere. The streets feel shaded, neighborhoods feel softer, and even dense areas feel calmer because of it. So that alone changes how a city feels when you are walking for long stretches. In terms of things to do, Washington offers a lot, but in a very particular way. The National Mall itself can occupy much of your time. The museums are another major part of that experience, and most of them are around the National Mall, and most of them are also for free. And there are museums for everyone. There are the Indigenous People Museum, African American, Air and Space Museum, Natural History. There's the National Gallery, I think, with all the portraits of famous people in history. So it's pretty cool. There are museums for everyone, and I personally enjoy seeing the National Archives, not only because it was featured in the movie National Treasure, which I loved as a kid, but because you see original copies of the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, which I thought it was pretty cool. I also visited Ford's Theater, the place where President Lincoln was assassinated. And even though the theater is not what it used to be, you really feel like stepping into a part of the history. Now, neighborhoods like Georgetown and Adams Morgan, they offer more of a social side of the city, places to eat, walk, and experience Washington beyond its institutional role. The jazz club that I've been was in Adams Morgan, and it was really cool walking there at night. You could see all kinds of people enjoying the nightlife. It was really nice. I didn't took time to visit places slightly outside the core, like Alexandria, so I can really talk about it. But inside Washington, there are also landmarks like the Washington National Cathedral and the Basilica of the National Shrine, which for me, I think it's pretty cool because of the architecture. I love taking my camera and take pictures of places, so I always love to see those cathedrals and basilicas. And for someone who is spiritual in this sense, would really enjoy seeing these places. Places also like Union Station and the Eastern Market feel more functional. Personally, I love visiting markets to see the city being alive a little bit. But it's spaces where daily life, happen alongside tourism. So I think they are also pretty nice to see. One thing I was a bit surprised was the cost. I honestly expected Washington to be cheaper than it was, especially when it came to accommodations. Hotels, at least in the areas that I stayed and walked through, they weren't cheap at all. And that definitely shapes how accessible a city feels for some travelers. But obviously, as in any other city, you can find cheaper accommodations and staying in cheaper places, probably hostels and stuff like this. But in any case, what really offsets the cost, in my opinion, is how many major attractions are free. You can visit museums, monuments, public spaces without paying anything, so you don't feel really gated, behind tickets or schedules. You can walk in, spend time, leave, and move on without constantly thinking about money. And that for me creates a feeling of openness. Even if the city isn't cheap overall, it doesn't feel restrictive or exclusive once you're actually moving through it. So, my conclusion after spending some time in Washington, I think it's a city that some people will absolutely love and others might struggle a little bit with. I can see how some visitors might find it boring if you're looking for constant stimulation, nightlife on every corner, or a fast, chaotic energy. I would say Washington probably isn't that kind of place. But for people who enjoy walking, observing, and especially history, I think Washington is a fascinating city, especially if you like museums, open spaces, architecture. I think DC has a lot to offer. For me, it felt really calm, intentional, and surprisingly human. It's not a city that tries to impress you loudly, but one that reveals itself the more time you give it.